Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so I hope you enjoy.
Number 10. Ling Chi. Ling Chi was an absolutely horrific practice that appeared in China around the year 900 and persisted through the Middle Ages. The word itself translates roughly to lingering death. It was a form of execution prevalent throughout China, Vietnam, and Korea. It was brutal, so prepare to be disturbed. Ling Chi was carried out with a knife and involved the victim being tied to a standing pole or some kind of wooden frame. The individual would then have portions of themselves removed over a very long stretch of time. Criminals who had done something particularly heinous, something like treason, would have their body parts removed one at a time but kept alive to endure as much misery as humanly possible. To make matters even worse, the punishment was typically performed in public. The person would be put somewhere central where other citizens could watch, and then they would suffer the lingering death for all to witness. It was also seen as a kind of double death. Confucians believed that to alter the body was a sin. The individual who suffered the slow death, being cut to pieces, would enter the spiritual afterlife disfigured. It was believed that by performing Ling Chi on someone, when they died and went to wherever they were going in the spirit realm, they would arrive missing all the pieces removed here on Earth. Number 9. Tasting urine. To get a reliable diagnosis for a medical condition in the Middle Ages, physicians would taste a patient's urine. The practice started long ago in ancient Greece. It was used by the Romans, and those that practiced medicine kept on doing it throughout the medieval days. They didn't just taste the urine, they analyzed it for color, consistency, and smell. The reason behind the obsession with urine was almost as bizarre as the obsession itself. During the Middle Ages, doctors were not typically allowed to directly examine their patients. It was uncouth for a doctor to take off somebody's clothing, and so there was no realistic way for them to examine a wound or a boil if it happened to be covered by clothing. Therefore, the much more discreet method of tasting pee became popular. If you happened to have a rash on your inner thigh, instead of looking at the rash, you would pee in a cup, and a doctor would swish it around in their mouth like they were tasting a vintage wine. And then there was the urine wheel. Doctors had their very own official chart in the form of a wheel that would help them to make the proper diagnosis based on the color of the patient's urine. Taste would typically correspond with a particular color, and this would allow doctors to make a surprisingly accurate diagnosis of what was bothering their patient. Colors ranged from yellow to green, and the same wheel was used regardless of social status. This was the gold standard of medicine up until the 19th century, and like I said earlier, it was surprisingly accurate. It was in the 17th century that the English physician Thomas Willis realized diabetic patients had urine that tasted sweet, like honey or sugar. Number 8. Gruesome diseases. Medieval people had a lot more misery to deal with than we do today. Most people will experience the common cold in their life, maybe a tooth infection, and perhaps a broken bone or two. But in the Middle Ages, disease was rampant and killed millions of people. Poor hygiene, a weak diet, and bizarre ideas on sanitation resulted in everything from the plague to tuberculosis. Some of the most popular diseases in the Middle Ages included malaria, diphtheria, smallpox, leprosy, syphilis, and dysentery. All of these things caused death, and it was all mostly because of weird beliefs on hygiene. If you were a peasant in the Middle Ages, you probably only took a bath once or twice a year. Most people didn't have access to clean water. Medieval folk weren't prancing around in clean rivers and drinking from clear, babbling brooks. They were forced to drink raw mead while they worked all day in the fields instead of fresh water. They had no idea that they were dehydrating their bodies and leaving themselves vulnerable to killer diseases. Then there was the sewage problem. Cesspools were typically shared by multiple families in a community and very quickly began to create health problems during population booms. Everyone would go to the bathroom in the same place, creating a kind of swamp of human waste. There's even the medieval tale of Roger the Raker, who fell through the rotten floorboards of his latrine and drowned in his own cesspool. Finally, hygiene was not high on the priorities list of most medieval peasants. It wasn't until the 15th century that soap was first produced using lime, oil, ash, and flour. But people back then had no idea that washing their hands could prevent disease, and so they went straight from the toilet to the dinner table. Number 7. Gross desserts. If you were to sit down for a 10-course meal in the Middle Ages, chances are you wouldn't make it through 2 of them. Eating habits have transformed a lot in the past few centuries, and the meals of yesteryear would be considered gruesome by today's standards. Sure, many meals might seem familiar. Medieval people did eat bread and vegetables, porridge, meat, and even pasta. But they also ate things like roasted swans, cooked peacocks, boiled cats, and spiced hedgehogs. Lacking the kind of entertainment we have today, they even came up with ways to make dinner more interesting. They created something called a living pie, which was a pastry stuffed with live frogs. This would be served at a dinner table to keep the guests delighted throughout the meal. They could eat their pastry, which the live frogs had been playing in, and then laugh while they tried to catch the terrified amphibians. Another very popular meal in the 17th century was beaver. It was a particularly favored meal by the Catholic Church because the church declared beaver as a fish. Since the beaver was such a great swimmer and because it was seen as such a tasty treat, the church called it a fish and allowed everyone to eat beaver on Fridays during Lent. And now for number 6. But first, it's shout-out time. Big thank you to Kimberly Baster and Aubrey Roberts for supporting this channel. Number 6. Left-handed Prejudice. There was some major prejudice against left-handed people in the Middle Ages. The stigma against left-handedness hasn't entirely gone away and has been seen as something borderline criminal and most certainly sinful since the days of the Bible. In the medieval period, being left-handed meant you were disabled. If you were left-handed in school, your teacher would tie your left hand behind your back and force you to use your right hand. And in the Bible, there are over 20 negative remarks made against left-handedness. For example, in Matthew it's written, "Then shall he say also unto them of the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." Basically, the Bible was saying that anyone who used their left hand would be sent to hell and burned in the devil's unending fire. In the Middle Ages, favoring your left hand could get you accused of practicing witchcraft. You could wind up being burned at the stake just for being born more inclined to your left. As recently as the early 20th century, Italian doctor Cesare Lombroso suggested people who used their left hand were mainly of the savage races or were women. It was only a century ago that a respected doctor claimed civilized men were right-handed while only barbarians and women used their left hands. Number 5. The wishing column. For the last 1,000 years, something very peculiar has been going on at the Hagia Sophia in Turkey. The Hagia Sophia itself was originally built as a cathedral, a Greek Orthodox church in 360 AD. Then, when Constantinople was taken over by the Ottoman Empire in 1453, it became a mosque. In 1935, it was transformed into a museum and then in 2020, reverted back into a mosque. The structure is fantastic. It's an excellent example of religious architecture at the beginning of the Eastern Roman Empire. But what we are here to talk about today is something called the wishing column and a legendary hole that people have been sticking their thumb into since the Middle Ages. To this very day, tourists visiting the Hagia Sophia make a wish, stick their thumb into the mysterious hole, and then wiggle it around a bit. The legend is that if your finger gets wet touching the column, it means your wish will be fulfilled. Either that or you'll be healed of an illness. Most scientists agree the hole is damp because of moisture gathering on the surface of the column. But according to the legend from the Middle Ages, it was all because of Saint Gregory, the miracle worker. In the year 1200, it's said the column began weeping healing liquid. Ever since then, people have been making pilgrimages to the alleged healing hole, hoping for a miracle. Number 4. Mustache Cups. Attitudes on facial hair change by the decade, and it's been that way since the beginning of time. Fashions come and go, rules on beards and mustaches are created and broken, and this was even true during the medieval days. But there was one particular contraption that came around in the early 1800s in England, something designed specifically for keeping mouth hair in check. It was a mustache cup designed to keep Victorian men's mustaches dry while they sipped their tea. If you were a dignified English gentleman in the 1800s, you most likely had a mustache. Mustaches were so popular during the Victorian era, the era of civility that came after the medieval days, that men even had manuals, rules, and grooming kits to ensure the perfect facial hair. There was mustache dye, mustache wax, and the mustache cup. The cup was built with a specialized lip near the top that would shield a man's mustache from whatever liquid was inside. It was a huge trend that spread like wildfire through England and even made its way to America. The mustache cup was used all the way until the 1930s when fashion changed and suddenly the mustache was no longer in season. Number 3. Groaning cheese. Having a new baby in the Middle Ages was a bizarre affair. In truth, having a baby has always come with its own unique and sometimes disturbing rituals. People used to spit on their babies as a way to protect them from the feared evil eye. Some people used to purchase extremely expensive wedding cakes to christen their babies. But the Middle Ages saw a fad so strange, it's hard to believe anyone ever thought it was a good idea. It was called groaning cheese, and it involved passing your baby through a ring of cheese on the day of their christening. It worked like this. A gigantic block of cheese was brought to the family of the baby. Then a hole would be cut in the wheel of cheese, just big enough to pass the baby through without smearing him or her in the cheese. And that was it. That was the whole ritual. The baby simply needed to be passed through the cheese delicately from one woman to another. People in England believed this was a surefire way to bless their child with good luck and great fortune. Then afterwards, the cheese would be divided up and everyone would have a cheese feast. Number 2. Terrifying medicine. We've already talked about the gruesome diseases that plagued, no pun intended, medieval Europe. We know most of these afflictions were caused by an ignorance of basic hygiene, but along with strange and terrifying illnesses came strange and terrifying medical treatments. One of the most popular was bloodletting, created by ancient physicians 3,000 years ago. The ancient Greeks believed the human body contained 4 main substances: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. If these 4 substances became imbalanced, it was believed a person could get sick, and so to cure the illness, the bodily substances needed to become balanced again. To do this, doctors would drain you of your blood. This could either be done by cutting your arms open or covering you with hungry leeches. But even though it was the Greeks who most likely came up with it, bloodletting continued to be a reliable treatment up until the days of George Washington. Some even say George Washington died as a result of complications following a bloodletting treatment. Another favorite cure-all was liquid mercury. Physicians in ancient China believed liquid mercury was required for the elixir of immortality. People died consuming huge amounts of mercury in hopes that they would become immortal. The use of mercury for curing sickness continued into the 20th century. In the medieval days, doctors treated STDs, primarily syphilis, by dosing people with deadly mercury. And yes, the mercury typically killed the patient. Number 1. The bear leader. One of the more bizarre jobs that could be found in the Middle Ages was bear leader. The bear leader was a man who literally led bears about the country. It was extremely popular among the Italians and French and was a well-respected profession. To become a bear leader, you first needed to find a bear. Once you found that bear, you then needed to tame it. Once you had your tamed bear, you could go from town to town and make money from its performances. Bears were used in a variety of different kinds of entertainment. They would perform mostly in cruel, barbaric, and horribly tragic blood sports. It was called bear baiting. The bear would fight in gladiator battles against packs of dogs or other fierce predators. It was the medieval equivalent of dog fighting, and the bear leader was typically the one who supplied the bears. And although it was gruesome and without a doubt morally wrong, medieval people didn't have much to do. They took whatever entertainment they could get, and the bear leader made a fortune off the fights. What do you think is the weirdest thing people in the medieval days did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe and come back soon for more awesome videos from the channel.